Many people here, and I want everyone to just come in, have a seat. I know that the sessions are ending, but also I know that on the end of this, literally on the very end of this, is the open bar for happy hour. So, but I think that this is a really special opportunity. I think that we as an industry and as a country are at a special moment as it relates to all of the focus on housing, the focus on women in areas of leadership. We have a record number of women running for president, holding high offices, and it does not escape me that the head of our organization is a woman. The head of one of the organizations who is leading the fight around making sure that we have adequate housing resources and programs and policies, having those conversations, is also a woman. And so we would not be doing our business, right, if we didn't take a moment to talk about how we as an industry help support, and every one of us help support women in leadership and create an environment that brings this caliber and quality of expertise to the forefront. So I appreciate you all having this conversation with us, and obviously everyone will be available for discussions afterwards. So I'll first with small introductions, because I don't believe these women are strangers to you. In case you are not aware, to my right is Adriane Todman. Adriane Todman is, of course, the president and CEO of NAHRO, the national organization. I have known Adriane for quite some time, almost as long as I've been in the industry. She, at the time, was heading the DC Housing Authority, one of the few women to lead a large housing authority across the nation. She was also very active in both CLAFA. I think you held a leadership position, vice president of CLAFA. But also, I came to find that part of her other job is to help elevate and encourage and mentor women that she saw coming up through the industry. Now, because I was in the federal government, I couldn't actually participate in the book club, but she shared herself with me generously. So Adriane will join us, and Diane Yentel. Diane Yentel runs the National Low Income Housing Coalition. If you guys have been paying attention, if you did a Google search, I would challenge any of you to do a Google search about affordable housing, find 10 articles, and I bet you 85% of them mention Diane Yentel. She has been working with several Democratic candidates as they put together full proposals, right, across the nation to talk about the affordable housing issues and helping develop and craft those. But also, if you have a private conversation with Diane, she's a very sort of unassuming person. However, you would not know that from her Twitter feed, where she is taking it to this administration every time they put forth a proposal that really harms families. I'm being a very active vocal voice in that fight. So I am looking forward to this conversation. I think the way that we'd like to start is just to have them spend a few minutes talking about what their career trajectory has been like, and how their careers have unfolded in the work that they do. So Adriane, can we start with you?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you again. It's been forever since yesterday. So I'll begin at the end. It was with great joy, just almost exactly to the day 2 years ago. My second anniversary as your CEO is on June 1st. But it was just 2 years ago where, as I was talking to then President Steve Merritt about joining the NAHRO team, that I understood that I would be the first female CEO of NAHRO in its entire 85-year history, which I did not know. I figured that somewhere in the 1970s there might have been somebody who would have been elevated at that point, but that's not the case. So I think that there's much pride that I have in terms of the role that I'm playing now in representing you and being the first woman to do so. How I got into this industry is a long story, but I'll keep it short. I moved to DC because I was like almost everybody else that moved to DC who is a type A former student government president, government major, who really wanted to come to the powerhouse of the country, you know, and wasn't interested in New York, wasn't interested in Atlanta, Miami. It was all about DC, and I got Potomac fever, is an old term of art, Potomac fever, when I came here as a 11th grader in high school and participated in a group called Close Up. I don't know if anybody's familiar with a civic organization named Close Up. And there was 11th grade Adriane from St. Thomas staying, actually probably somewhere in Crystal City, one of the Marriotts there, with a cohort of other 11th graders from across the country, going to Capitol Hill for the first time, going past the Supreme Court, going through OEOB, and saying, wow, what is this place? It feels really cool. I feel comfortable. And from that point, went back to St. Thomas and told my mommy, I'm going to move to DC. I will say, I had a similar experience with my daughter, who, when she had her first visit to New York City, as we came up, you know, Penn Station, up the escalator, and you get to the top, and it's all the lights, turned to me and said, "Mommy, I'm going to move to New York City." So it felt that that would happen, and she did. She lives there right now. But from that moment, being sort of the young version of myself, I recognized then the opportunity that DC had in terms of being able to have an authentic moment even in a power structure. Even in a power structure. You saw it in display. So left graduate high school, went to Western Massachusetts, a liberal arts women's college named Smith College, and I will tell you that it was there that I learned what feminism is and was, as the Smith is the ground zero for two of this country's preeminent women in terms of the struggle, Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem. And so really it was at that moment I understood more than ever what it meant to be a female in this country and what empowerment felt like. Left Smith, moved here to DC because I was gonna come live here in DC. I came as an intern, like a lot of people do. I interned on Capitol Hill for a summer. Was very fortunate to be able to land a job with the congressman who represents the Virgin Islands, Ron DeLugo, who was very tenured at the point that I joined him. Had a fabulous 4 years there until the Gingrich Revolution occurred, and then a lot of us left the Hill. My boss had already announced his retirement, but when when the power structure changes, there's not a lot of jobs for the party, the staffers of the opposing party. So left the Hill and said, well, what am I going to do now? And from another woman who happened to be in my woman's circle, found out about a job at HUD, working for this little startup program called Hope 6. Right? At that point, it wasn't Hope 6, it was the Urban Revitalization Demonstration. I knew nothing about housing, I knew nothing about nothing. I mean, I did at the Hill, but it was a job. and started in that office during its very, very early years, and had a fabulous time there, and there's some other stories tied to that, and had a wonderful time at HUD. I mean, probably I was at HUD during the Henry Cisneros years, and there was probably no more exciting a time to be inside that building than during his tenure as a secretary. I left there, consulted a little bit, landed as a consultant at the DC Housing Authority, and the rest is history. So I'll stop there because I wanted to certainly give my colleague Dan some time. But there's it woven into that. There are people who are male and female who helped young Adriane become the Adriane that you see today, and we can talk about that later.
That's great. Now it is. That's great. I didn't actually know that you were the first woman in your position in 85 years of NAHRO's history. Wow. Well, I'm so glad you're here. It's about time. It's about time, right? So I've been an activist for a long time, since I was quite young, through various volunteer initiatives. My mom and I did Hands Across America. Do you all remember? Does anybody remember that in like 80 something? We did Hands Across America. Things like that. I've always wanted to kind of change the world. And so my first way of doing that after undergraduate, where my minor was in women's studies, I joined the Peace Corps, and I had wanted to do that since I learned about its existence in 10th grade social studies. So I became a Peace Corps volunteer, and I moved to very rural Zambia, which is in Central Africa, and I lived there for about 3.5 years. Peace Corps volunteers usually serve for 3 years, but I felt like I wasn't done yet at the end of my 2 years, and I extended for a third. And it's a life-changing experience. Such a rich, challenging, tremendous experience, where I lived with and worked with and became good friends with people living in some of the most severe poverty that I had never even imagined. And I learned so much from them about their tenacity and their perseverance, and about poverty itself and its health impacts and all the ways that it harms people. So after I left the Peace Corps, I decided to go to school to become a social worker. And initially I had thought that I was going to do individual counseling as a social worker. And very quickly in my studies and in my internships, I saw again, sort of was brought back to my original understanding, that systemic change was what's most needed. And any kind of individual counseling that I could do for me felt like Band-Aids, when it was so clearly larger structural issues that were keeping people poor. And so I switched over to the macro track in social work. And I had a really powerful internship. I was lucky enough to work on a national study on the impacts of welfare reform on mothers and their children. And it was an ethnographic study, and I had 5 women that I was working with and following, and every month for a year, I would go to each of those 5 women's homes and interview them about different aspects of their lives, schooling and their kids' health and how they paid for diapers. And it was so clear. Some of them, a couple of them lived in public housing. One was a voucher holder. The other 2 were just unable to pay the rent and living on different people's couches on and off throughout the year. And it was so clear in that experience just how central a person's home is to their ability to thrive in any kind of area of their lives. And the difference just in the kids' health and how they were able to do in school, and the mom's mental health based on whether or not they had a home was so clear. So after graduate school, I really cast a pretty wide net in terms of trying to get my first job, and wanted to work on something related to poverty. And I ended up in Massachusetts at the Coalition for the Homeless. And I was a housing policy coordinator and organizer, and that's where I really started my housing career and got to dig in deep into learning about and understanding housing policy, and continue working with public housing residents and others through organizing. And that was when I first got to know the National Low Income Housing Coalition too, because that was when the coalition had its National Housing Trust Fund campaign. And so as a baby housing coordinator, I would take NLIHC's flyers and bring them to our membership meetings and ask everybody to call their member and get the Housing Trust Fund enacted. So after a few years, I had an opportunity to move down to DC in 2005 for my first job at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I was a housing policy analyst. And I worked here for 3 years, really fell in love with the organization. Sheila Crowley was the CEO at the time, and she was one of my strongest and earliest, most powerful influences on me in my career, and she became a mentor and a friend. And I worked with her for 3 years. Then I moved on to a few other organizations. I worked at Oxfam America for a little while. I went to HUD, where I met Shauna. Shauna was my boss. It's a little unknown fact. Shauna's
all our bosses.
Yeah, Shauna is the boss. So Shauna was the head of the public housing program. And under her, I was the director of the Public Housing Management and Occupancy Division. Worked there for a couple of years, and then I went to Enterprise Community Partners, where I became, over time, I started as the director, and then was senior director, and then was vice president of public policy. And speaking of some of the, I think we'll talk about this, but some of the women who have helped me along the way, Shauna was certainly one, and we can talk about that a little bit. The space that she created for me to really grow and thrive was very purposeful and deliberate and effective. And also I think often of Terry Ludwig and Ali Solis, who were my bosses at Enterprise, who promoted me to vice president of public policy when I was 8 months pregnant, which I feel like maybe only a female boss would do, and I'm tremendously appreciative of that. And then Sheila Crowley came and told me that she was retiring, and I had this opportunity to come back into this role as CEO. It's been 3 years now, and it felt immediately like coming home and coming to the place where I think all of this has been about. For me to be able to be in this position, I feel tremendously grateful to be in a position where I can really use my authentic voice in terms of how I think we can solve the housing crisis. And that's how I got to where I am today.
Well, thank you. So, right. So, you know, the title of this is Women in Leadership. But I believe strongly that we should all be feminists, right, in terms of creating an environment where everyone can thrive and go after whatever they want to, and particularly as it relates to their career. So you both sort of touched on it a bit, but I'm going to ask you to give us a few examples of people who created that space, created opportunities for you, or helped really lead you to where you are today. And I'd like for you to give me an example of men and women, because I think that everybody plays a role in that.
So I think also the woman part is easy. Probably the earliest influencer in my career is a woman named Carol Thompson Cole. And some of you who have lived in Washington, D.C. For a minute will remember that she was the city administrator who worked with Marion Barry and was the person who took over, who ran the city when he was incarcerated. And I knew her because she went to my alma mater. And so again, as a young woman, and particularly a young woman who, you know, not here from the States, sort of like moving around and navigating based on wit and charm, but not connection, you know, I approached her one day at a Black alum conference at Smith and said, I want to move to DC, and I would love for you to help. And this is Carol at her prime. Like, she is running Washington, D.C. You know, she is just a power broker. But she's also a very humble and very open and accessible human being. And so she allowed me to she not only taught me about the elements of DC. There's the federal and there's the local, and you know, and what it meant to be in DC. But she even opened up her home and allowed me to stay at her place when I was interviewing as a senior in college, which means everything, you know, which means everything. So she was so gracious, and I think that for the past several decades, not two several, but a couple decades, you know, at least one decade, you know, she has remained and as somebody in my life. Every time I was moving from one place to another, she was somebody that even if we had not connected in a year or two, it was easy to have the conversation with her. And then as a gentleman, I would say Kevin Marchman. Some of you may know Kevin. And what made him somebody influential in my life is at HUD. Not only did he hire me, but I was the youngest and lowest person on the totem pole, and we would be in these meetings with some folks who are heavy hitters. You all might recall, I'll spade some names, but heavy hitters at HUD then, and we'd go around in the room and talk about what we were going to do and what ERT was going to be and Hope 6, and then we had all these different things at the secretary, and he would intentionally say, and Adriane, what do you think? Adriane, what in this room of powerhouses in the industry then, and at that point I'm in my late mid-20s, he would say, and Adriane, what do you think? And I was like, oh, okay, well, here's what I think. That doesn't often happen. You know, when you're new, usually you're just supposed to learn and be quiet, but he was very intentional to say, not only do I know you have something to say, I want to hear you say it, and I want everybody else to see that I'm asking you. And so I think those are my two examples. Diane?
Those are great examples. And actually hearing the example of Kevin reminds me of a professor that I had in undergraduate school. She was one of my women's studies professors. And it was a small class, and it was the kind where you'd read something in advance and it was meant to be a discussion. And I'm an introvert, and I'm generally not one to speak out, actually, unless it's my job to do that. But in a crowd or in a room, I'm usually the one, I like to listen, I like to observe, I like to watch other people and think about what they're saying, and I'm very engaged, but I'm not always in the center of the conversation. And she would make me, I mean, every class, by the end of the class, if I hadn't spoken yet, she would call on me and ask me to speak up and speak out. And at the time, it was so painful and so irritating. And now I see how important it was, because of course it's important to do more than observe and listen and think, but to actually use our voices and speak from our experience and our expertise. So she really forced that on me, and I'm grateful for it. And really my whole career has been, I've worked in a number of places, and almost all of them I've been really fortunate to work for really strong, powerful women. And in each of those, and I don't know if that was by chance or by fortune or how it worked out that way, but when I think about sort of the number of women that I've worked for, and how clearly and deliberately each of them made an effort in different ways to make room and create space for me to do more. It's what's led me to where I am today. In terms of men, the one that really stands out is my husband, and that's because he's a big reason for the last 15 years for why I'm able to do what I do in my career and have children, and that's because he's a stay-at-home dad. And his willingness and eagerness to do that makes my job possible. It makes it possible for me to travel and to be able to have kind of a high-intensity, high-expectation job, and it works really well for all of us. We all love it and thrive within it, and I'm grateful for that as well.
So I'm gonna steal a little bit of my personal knowledge of you. And since you brought up the example of Diane has 2 young sons, and one of her sons said that when he grows up, right, he's going to be the stay-at-home dad, like, because that's what he sees. And
well, he said that, or he said he wants to be what I am because he wants to come to the office with me.
But so when Diane told me this story, the thing that really stood out was that her sons didn't have some of the same sort of gender role stereotypes or identification about who they are supposed to be in the world, right? And what work looks like for them. So that brings me to the next question, because I do think that we oftentimes are subject to, right, expectations of what behavior is male, what behavior is female, and just as we in the last presidential election, it didn't matter if one of the candidates was smarter, no one liked her, right? Nobody liked the other guy, but we don't need to like the guy, right? And so how do you see these things play out in your work, and how do you help counsel or create an environment where people are able to move and do the things that actually will help support their career, whether it's speaking out, getting credit for their work, feeling comfortable with a little friendly competition around a project, because those are typically very male. So,
do you want to go first this time? Or
yeah.
So there is an expectation of how women are supposed to behave. right? There's an expectation about how women are supposed to behave. And I have certainly, particularly in my last position, run into that wall several times about you're not behaving right. Of course, nobody says it like that. Right? Nobody says you're not behaving right. It's always very subtle, like, she just, she keeps telling everybody what to do. She bossy. Why is she so bossy? Why she keeps speaking up? Just be quiet. Let everybody else sort of get their thing in. Just sort of don't talk so much. And so here's where upbringing becomes, right? Because you are who you are because of who you've been, right? You are who you are because of who you've been. So there was it's the double threat. I grew up, I'm a West Indian woman. when all is said and done, when all is said and done and all the CEOs and boom, 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 and that is gone, at the core of it, I'm a West Indian woman. So that was an issue in terms of saying, hey, be quiet, don't talk, you're too bossy. And then I had this amazing experience at this amazing college whose sole mission is to empower females and women and to find their authentic voice and power and to go out there and expose it to the world. So it was actually kind of funny when I would run into those moments, because I'd say, wow, really? This is so not going to work in your favor. But what I learned is you have to meet other people where they are and show them that, yes, I am not going to just sit and be timid and quiet, and I'm not going to allow you. This is one of the things that I've taught my daughter, which is being in the room. Many women, you probably have felt this or heard it. Being in the room, saying something, it's a good idea. Nobody really responds. It's like some polite nodding. Couple clicks later, somebody else who may happen to be male of either race says the same thing, and it's like, wow, where did that come from? I have never missed a beat, and all you young ladies out there, I have never missed a beat to turn and say, you know what, John? It's so funny that you agree with me with the idea that I just talked about 15 years ago. Let's have this conversation every single time. Never abdicate your ability and never abdicate your intelligence to anybody, particularly if they're trying to take it from you. So I think that I came about this experience in terms of running into that behavior wall in maybe a little bit differently because of these two powerful experiences I had in my life.
To build on that and answer maybe the second part of the question about how do we create an environment that cultivates that, I think having had similar experiences and remembering a time maybe earlier in my career where I'd be faced with a challenge or a question, and I would sort of coach myself to think, how do men respond to this? When you get to those moments where it's like, well, should I go for that promotion? I don't know. I mean, maybe these 3 other people might want to go for that promotion, or maybe these 3 other people might be more capable or more ready for that. And I would think many of the men that I've worked with and known and loved over the years don't ask themselves that question. They're confident that they are the right person for that job, and they're going to go for it. And I think there's been times, other situations, where I've asked myself that question, and then over time I've learned that, well, that's also how would a woman respond to this, and it's how would a woman respond who's comfortable and confident in their own abilities and their own expertise. And in terms of how I hope to cultivate that with women that I work with, whether they're in our office or colleagues across the country, I really believe that the best ideas and the best work come from multiple voices and multiple people. There's almost no project or campaign or idea that I can think of that it was one person's idea. One person sort of plants the seed and others add on. It's like a painting, right? And different people have different brushes and different colors that they're using, and at the end, it's this beautiful piece of art that couldn't have been as powerful if it hadn't had so many people putting their mark on it. And I really believe that the best ideas are the ones that at the end of the brainstorming meeting or the end of the day are the ones where you think, whose idea was this? Like, because it's such a joint effort. That's not always the way it can work or the way that it happens, but I do try to cultivate that and ask for creativity and welcome creativity and ask for ideas, and wherever they come from, if it's a good one, if it's something that adds a new dimension to the work that we're doing, then to treat it, whether it's from my executive assistant or from my chief operating officer, and whether they're male or female, to really welcome and create an environment where people feel safe to offer their ideas and have those ideas be valued.
And I think that's a key point, is as female leaders, and I think this doesn't always happen, is creating that sense of safety for people to say something that they otherwise would not have said because they feel there'll be this backlash. You know, you do have to create a moment where you can give an idea, and that's really almost any gender. You give an idea and it's still welcomed, and it's still welcome. And so often I think that little girls are taught to, one, don't speak up as much, but when they do, you remember like the fourth grade, fifth grade moment where somebody's like, oh, that's just, that's silly, that's a silly, and that kind of stays with you. That kind of stays with you. So I think that as adults and as those of you who are managers out there and those of you who want to elevate into management, creating that safe space is one of the most powerful things that we can do for our peers and for people who report up to us.
So I had a few questions that I had, put together, but we have about 2-3 minutes left. And so instead, I'm going to ask you if you could leave this group, right? I see faces of young women whom I work with, women at points of leadership within their career, young men who are at the beginning of their career, and men in leadership roles, right, who are responsible for making the same space available, not just for women, but for everyone within their organization. So if you could leave this group with one thing about how you build a diverse and welcoming team that is welcoming to women and others, what would that be? No pressure. No pressure. And the alcohol is like 2 minutes away. So just.
No pressure, and the other side of this is free booze. So I think, just building on our last comments about creating a safety zone, I would also say that if you are in the room, you should be in the room, right? A lot of times folks will say, well, I'm in this room and I'm supposed, I might, wherever I am in the food chain of employment here, I'm in the room, but no one's gonna value what I say. No one's going to care about what I say. And the number one thing to understand is that if you are in that room, you got there because somebody wanted you there, or you got there of your own volition. You broke through and you're in that room. Own your space and own your voice. Don't never, ever, ever discredit your ability to contribute. My daughter had the great fortune of going to Princeton, and I remember her freshman year, she began to have the doubt thing. So she was going to classes and she'd say, I don't know if I'm supposed to be here, And I said, baby doll, let me tell you something. That if those really intelligent folks at the Princeton Admissions Committee selected you to be in the class of 2018, let me tell you something. You're supposed to be in that room. So any room that you are in, this room, another room, never discredit the fact that what you say counts. It always counts. And you'd be surprised, sometimes when there was a younger version of me, I would sit in the room and I would have an idea, and I'd say, I've got this idea, but I'm not going to say it, because it might not sound right, I might not say it right, and everybody else is like 20 or 25 years old, I might say it right. Then at the end of the meeting, somebody said something that was exactly my idea, and I said, that was my idea, you know? So I would say, if you have it, and you feel it, and you want to say it, go for it, because people will respect the fact that you had the courage to put it out there. So I'd say, if you're in a position to draw that out of people, do it. If you are not drawing it out of yourself, then be it.
Yeah, say it and be the person who welcomes it when little Adriane says her idea. Be the person who says, even if it's not something that you're going to go with that day, but to welcome the voice and welcome the idea and welcome the thoughts. And I mean, similarly, just really quickly to think about diversity and think about, you're in the room, who's not in the room, and why aren't they? And how can you create space for them to be there? And there's a lot of different ways to do that depending on sort of where you are in your job or in your career, in your life. But, you know, if I see one more panel of all white men giving their expertise at a conference, I am going to tweet at them and say, it is 2019. And this is nothing against white men. Some white men are some of the my favorite people in my life, some of the smartest people I know. And there are other smart people out there and other voices that need to be heard. So if you're one who's if you're creating the panel, don't do that. If you're invited to speak on a panel, or if you're in a boardroom, or if you're in a team meeting, look around and notice who's not there, and don't be afraid to ask why, and to challenge people to think about why, and to think about how to create the space for more diversity and more voices so that the ideas that come out and the work that comes out at the end is the best it can possibly be.
Do we have questions for the others? We have time for, the panel is willing to take questions. Oh, we do. We have a question.
Yeah, we'll repeat it. We can repeat it.
I'm coming.
Oh, wait.
Hi, Deborah Jackson, DC Housing Authority. I'd like to say thank you to Ms. Todman. You were and always will be a mentor of mine. I was lucky enough to be underneath of her for a couple of years. But my question is, as women, we are sometimes our hardest critic to each other. And how do we cultivate an environment where we're encouraging each other and promoting each other instead of, as we say, knocking each other's crowns off, adjusting them? And so that's my question to you.
Right. And isn't that right? You know, a lot of times we'd get into a situation where if it's just you and the other woman in the room and it's all men, I'm not going to say this happens all the time, but for some people, some of the time, there's that, you know, that moment, that, you know, there can only be one of us, Mufasa thing that happens, you know. So I think that maturity, that, you know, I will say that, so some women who are still very young, it's a learning experience to learn that other women are not your competitor. And that it is our responsibility, and I would say doubly so for Black women, our responsibility, particularly for those of us who are a little bit older, not me, a little bit older, to say, you know what, because that's probably going through her mind, you've got to be the one to make sure that it's not. You know, you've got to be the one to approach and say, you know, Patricia, that's a great idea that you shared in that meeting. Thank you for sharing that. And sometimes it takes that, but I think you have to learn, sometimes painfully, you have to learn that skill. And it's like moments like these that, you know, we share it with you all, and hopefully you all share it with somebody else, that it becomes a learned skill, that you're not competing, you know, we're sisters, you know, we're sisters. And that's a reverb in that, where people, it's a learned activity, and I hope some people learn it sooner rather than others.
Yeah, and I wonder if there might be, over time, as more women are in leadership positions, whether there might be less of that. And I don't even mean so much because women cultivate different environments. Maybe that's true sometimes, sometimes it's not. I think it's more, it just strikes me that that's more people operating from an idea of scarcity. There's not enough room for all of us. But I think maybe as we recognize that and we shift our thinking to one of abundance, there's room for all of us, and if we're lifting each other up, we'll get there sooner, that might shift. And I've also found that, you know, again, when I think back over my career and the women who have been mentors to me and bosses to me and friends to me, that powerful, accomplished women aren't threatened by other powerful, accomplished women. They tend to welcome that. And they see people who want to accomplish and create space for them. So I think if you find yourself in an environment like that, to look for the women who are secure in their power and their abilities, and seek them out as mentors, because they'll create space for other women all the time.
So thank you. Thank you both for having this conversation. I will leave the audience with one thing. Just as we've heard all of this guidance about what we do and how we support one another, you know, we talked about people in leadership positions. If you're in the room, you know, ask who's not in the room. Well, everyone can lead from where they are, right? So you don't have to be the COO or the executive director or the manager or the director of this, right? You can have a partner or someone that you work with within the organization and say, why isn't that person here? Because you know that they add value. So we can all lead from where we are to help create the environment that really supports all of us in our work. And I thank you for sharing yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Shauna. Is it time for the free booze?
The bar is open.